Okay, so what I'm going to try to present is what happened in the G20 of France and what is happening in the G20 of Mexico. And the reason I am talking of 20 of France to Mexico is because the first stage of the G20 of Mexico is to assess what was the progress of the action plan that was pushed forward in the G20 of France. Now, the G20 of France, as it was mentioned before, and in some cases I will try to move fast in some of the slides because they have already been thought, is because we were in a period of extreme price spikes and extreme volatility. This is just today where we are. This is the FAO index. The red line, the 2012, shows that prices are still high, although they are under the levels of 211, but still they stay high, although they are starting to stabilize, and we see the same thing in the case of volatility. Historically, and why France focused a lot more on volatility is because historically the spikes we saw in 2007, 2008, and 2010, 11 were not the highest ones in the history. There were periods even closer in the 80s that were higher even than the one that we were facing in 2007, 2008 in real terms. Now, in terms of volatility, on the contrary, we saw an historical increase in the amount of volatility. What this graph is just showing is what we define in a model that we have at IFPRI called the XQ model, a period of excessive price volatility. So basically what I am counting here is by each year and by each type of commodity, how many days of excessive price volatility our model is capturing. And if you want to know the details of what is excessive and how we statistically define excessive, you can find it in the Food Security Portal, which every day we upload our model and when we define a day as a day of excessive price volatility. But the message here, if you look across the commodities, 2006, 2007, 2008, were basically a peak in terms of excessive period of volatility. This is extreme, okay? The extreme levels of volatility. So clearly, historically, we were in a time that was high in terms of volatility, of excessive volatility, relative to what we were seeing in prices, in price levels in real terms, which were not the historical highs. So this was a core problem for the Paris G20, and the whole initiative behind what Sarkozy was trying to push is how we can cope with this, because it's something new which we didn't see at those levels in the past. Although, if we go to later years, to 2011 and even to 2012, the volatility is starting to slow down, but we don't see that the structural problems behind the volatility, as it was mentioned before, have been resolved yet. Now, because of that, the major recommendations that came in the Paris G20 focus on several things, and Joe has already mentioned many of them. So one was the AMIs, and what I'm trying to do here is to do an assessment. In red, you will see what I believe is the progress up to now. So this is my own personal assessment of how things are going. So AMIs was supposed to create transparency, was supposed to improve collection of data of G20 countries plus key exporting and importing countries on reserves, which was a problem that was mentioned before. And AMIS has progressed. There is a secretariat working. There is a portal, which still is not announced publicly. And there is also an infrastructure which is being set up with the countries so that they can start reporting their statistics on reserves. This will work as long as the countries report information to AMIS. And in some cases, this is happening, but in others, we don't know yet how well it will work. But also, AMIS is linked to the Rapid Response Forum, which the new president of the Response Forum is sitting here for the next year, and which held its first meeting in Mexico. And the idea there was to define ways in which we can identify those abnormal international market conditions, because it's the trigger that will make the forum to discuss and to make decisions around that. So those things are progressing, not at the velocity we would have liked, but it's not easy because you have to coordinate with all the countries involved. But there is significant movement, and that will help to have better statistics and better information, and also have a mechanism to identify those abnormal situations in the market. Then there was the International Research Initiative of Wheat Improvement, which was launched in September 2011, and the Global Action Plan has been developed by the CIR, and there is a clear business plan to that. The Global Agricultural Year Monitoring Initiative, which also was mentioned by Joe, is also launched, and there is a proposal, a work plan of what they plan to do, although still there is no clear implementation on that. But what I will help is to strengthen the capacity to produce and use satellite data to be able to have better information on production. The Tropical Agriculture Platform, which is doing a consultation process to try to define, with the stakeholders, to define a scope and nature of the activity. Then there was the issue of the reserves, which was mentioned before. But one of the first things that was that went through a lot of discussion during the meeting was the possibility of moving food because of humanitarian reasons across borders without restrictions. And although the recommendation of the IOs was to do it across the board, it was restricted to WFP. So that went on, but still there is a need to seek resolution from the WTO on that topic. The emergency reserve, and no, this is an emergency humanitarian reserve. This is not buffer stocks and so on. This is humanitarian to reduce the problem of access and to be linked to safety nets to minimize the effect. The the action plan tried to push this through a regional development through ECOWAS. So the PREPARE, which was the work plan developed by WFP with some international organizations, was sent to the ECOWAS, and they are coordinating to try to implement the pilot at the level of ECOWAS. There is a task force developed by ECOWAS, but still the process is very slow, and there is no clear implementation. So this pilot has to be tested, because that was the concept behind the action plan, is to develop a pilot to test. ECOWAS was selected, and they are supposed to implement it to test how the pilot works, and then it can be scaled up. But that is moving very slow. The voluntary guidelines on governance of tenure of land, fisheries, and forests in the context of national food security, the guidelines were approved by the CFS, although still implementation at the country level is a complexity that needs to be taken into account. And then the principles of responsible agriculture investment, which is also in a pilot which is being summarized. Then we have the risk management tools that were led mostly by the World Bank. And there was, IFC have developed what they call the agricultural price risk management, and there is a platform on agricultural risk management, but still there is a lot to do here. The tools are starting to be launched, but they are not yet tested, so there is a lot of work to be done here. Similar in the case of financial regulations, the important here of the financial regulation is not only to impose regulations on derivative markets and so on. The important thing of the G20 was to try to find ways in which you could coordinate across the regulatory agencies of the world, because you don't need to resolve the problem only in Chicago, you need to resolve the problem in all of them at the same time, at least with a harmonization of the regulations, because if not, as a colleague of here, Manuel Hernandez, has shown with his colleagues, there will be a transmission of the shock. So if I close Chicago and regulate Chicago and I don't resolve the problem in Europe, then it will go through Europe. So we need to be very careful on how we do this. And there is still a report to be presented by IOSCO, which is the Association of Security Commissions, that are trying to work into this to create this harmonization. Now, let me now move to Mexico. So the first step is to assess what is going on, and as you see, in some cases there is progress, in others the progress is not as we will have liked. The core goal of the Mexico G20 was to increase production and productivity in a sustainable way to promote food security and foster economic growth. So they were trying to look into a more structural problem on how we can increase productivity, because they knew that the markets, and I have shown this graph before, of export markets are highly concentrated, so we need to increase productivity across. It's not only an issue of the short term, it's an issue of how we can diversify this portfolio, where the top 5 countries basically control most of the exports of these commodities. For example, if I just look at soybeans today, the price of soybeans is skyrocketing, and the reason is because there is droughts in Paraguay, droughts in Argentina, and also there is a switch in production in the case of the US, which are the key exporters. Paraguay is the 4th exporter, Argentina is the 5th, and the US also, and therefore any change in any of those countries automatically will affect prices. So that's one of the structural problems that they need to look at, and that was one of the reasons why they decided to focus on productivity. Also, in terms of annual growth rates in world crop yields, this graph produced in the AO report basically shows that the average global rates of growth in yield of most of the major cereals are declining, and although we have some increases in the case of Africa and so in other regions, still there is a lot of heterogeneity even within Africa, which doesn't allow to have yet the yields that we have, and there is a declining trend in terms of yields. Similarly, in terms of investment, the expenditures in agriculture, the public expenditures in agriculture, still are lower than the rate that you will expect with respect to the agricultural GDP in OECD countries. And again, in Africa, there is an improvement. In sub-Saharan Africa, after a decade of stagnation, we see an improvement, but still the heterogeneity within sub-Saharan Africa is huge, so you cannot have the change that you are expecting in terms of public investment in agriculture. So as a result of that, there were new recommendations proposed by the IOs to try to help this. And I will just roughly explain one by one. These are 8 recommendations, and I have tried to summarize some of them. The first one, of course, is to increase agricultural productivity through investment in sustainable approach to productivity growth. supporting improving agricultural and rural statistics in public and private investment in agricultural productivity. So data and collection of good statistics in public expenditures is really important. There was a lot of difficulty to get papers on total factor productivity for the world and for sub-Saharan Africa. There were a lot of issues on the quality of the data and so on. Improving trade policies, this is something that was basically also in the Paris G20, and we brought it again as part of the IOs because we wanted to reinforce the importance of reducing any distortion in trade, both in export and import markets, because we know that that's important, and also looking to promote issues on phytosanitary measures developed in the Codex Alimentarius. Why it's important? This is just a few weeks ago. Russia again said that there were some fears of potential export bans. The prices start to spike again in the case of wheat. And we know in work that has been done here by Buea and David Laborde that the policy effect because of those export restrictions could basically double the effect of the shock, of the initial shock. So we need to be very careful on these type of restrictions, and that's why the IO report again tried to bring them up into the recommendations. Then one of the new things that we believe is pretty important in the Mexico G20 is this link between the private and the public sector. So one of the efforts of the Mexicans has been to bring this B20, the Business 20 meeting, and link it with the G20 meeting. And the reason is because they want to promote public-private partnerships for investment in agriculture. And the work is how to enable the environments to be able to do that, and to improve investment in agricultural innovation systems, and to try to find ways in which we also can collect better information. And there is a recommendation to support the agricultural science and technology indicators, the AST indicators, which are hosted by IFPRI, to try to improve the collection of data across countries and to have better indicators available of what is the situation of technology indicators in the world. Again, there is a need to improve information and access on IPR systems on plant and animal genetic resources that Joe mentioned before, and also to improve investments in agricultural innovation systems, continuing to what was put in place in the G20, the wheat initiative. Now there is also the corn potential initiative, and trying to improve the data on ASTI. On water, because of the importance of sustainability and the restriction that we will face in water, there is also a set of recommendations on how we can improve technologies to be more water efficient and trying to reduce the constraints that we will face in the future. Sustainable use of natural resources within the short-term imperatives of ensuring food security, to look at the policies that are in place and to try to assess them. And for example, here it's very important to evaluate the smart subsidies that has been popular in many sub-Saharan African countries, and trying to assess what their impacts, if they are proper in the medium long term, and what are the problems, because most of them has been implemented without a clear evaluation behind. And also there is this issue of improving the competition in the input sector. And for us, this is pretty important because in the work we have been doing here together with a colleague, Manuel Hernandez from IFPRI, we found that there is a significant concentration, especially in the fertilizer industry, which means that just increasing the competition in the fertilizer industry, this is a distribution of the key countries in terms of production capacity, just increasing a little bit the competition will create significant effects. Of course, this is a non-linear effect, but just doing a simple calculation of a decrease of 10% in the concentration, that means, for example, creating a new plant of fertilizer will create a significant effect in terms of fertilizer use, in terms of increasing production, and in terms of increasing rural income. So that's something to look carefully to assess the effects, and of course to continue doing analysis to capture the non-linearities, because it's not just an issue of putting more fertilizer in the land, but it's clearly a problem in the input markets, and something similar is happening also in the seed markets that we need to take care. On risk management, the platform of risk agricultural management has been proposed. The Global Index Insurance Facility, they are trying to support that. And one initiative that also we believe is very important is to improve the quality of the information of weather, so climatological agencies. Although there is a UN agency which is in charge of this, clearly there is an importance to improve the quality of historical data and also future collection of data of climate, because that will help insurance companies to develop plans for smallholders, but also will help to reinsurance companies to go into this market with more certainty and without needing to have huge subsidies like we have currently in developed countries. And there is an initiative called Weather Info for All that basically was trying to use cellular towers to put climatological equipment and use the cellular technology to transfer the information, which apparently is a very cheap way to do it. This initiative started 2 years ago. it still is not yet implemented, and the idea is to try to promote similar initiatives with the private sector. And then on human capital development, there was the idea of support the provision of well-designed and gender-sensitive social protection programs, which are essentially, especially for the short-term issues, explicit integration of agricultural education and sustainable agriculture intensification agenda, but especially to bridge the gap, the gender gap, which clearly is identified as a problem, and to promote indices like the Women Empowerment Index that has been announced or launched 2 weeks ago. So the idea is how we close that gap and how we identify what is the current situation and how we can increase the technology and infrastructure needed for women also to be able to participate in the agricultural commodities. So just to finalize, I'm sorry I rushed through all these recommendations. The core issue is that there is an importance and a need of investment in agriculture, but, and that will improve this portfolio of exporting countries, which is a structural problem. Improve better information on where to invest and in public information of expenditures, which is extremely important, which will help to increase productivity in a sustainable basis. Enable the environment for increased private-public partnerships. That's pretty important, and there is need to do that and to find clear rules of the game across the different countries, and to increase food production and productivity in sustainable basis, and especially to increase competition in the input markets. And of course, better information for risk coping mechanisms, which is something that is supposed to start to move since the Paris G20, but it's something that we need to put a lot more effort on that. Thank you.